Welcome to Culture, Worldview, and Origins. We're Tim and Holly Nyquist. We're in Chapter 13 on Kuhn's critical thinking. This is session number 12. Session 12 represents Chapter 12, which is the resolution of revolutions. They are men so young or so new to the crisis-ridden field that practice has committed them less deeply than most of their contemporaries to the worldview and rules determined by the old paradigm. So who can or who would be a part of a paradigm change? And what Thomas Kuhn is suggesting is it's the young men, it's the new ones that are coming in. They are men so young or so new to the crisis-ridden field that practice has committed them less deeply than most of their contemporaries to the current paradigm. How are they able, and what must they do to convert the entire profession or the relevant professional subgroup to their way of seeing science and the world? What causes the group to abandon one tradition of normal research in favor of another? You're picking out now different terms here of what Thomas Kuhn is saying, their way of seeing science and the world. So Kuhn is saying, how are they able? Because they don't have the competence, they don't have the authority, they don't have the prestige. So how are they able to come in and think differently, think outside the box? Insofar as he is engaged in normal science, the research worker is a solver of puzzles, not a tester of paradigms. So again, the resolution of revolutions. Who can see a revolution? Well, it's not ingrained in the normal scientific process to look for revolutions, to look for paradigm changes. They are problem solvers, and each paradigm has its problems, and it has to have problems. Otherwise, it wouldn't have anything to solve. So the thing is, when does it cross over from being a puzzle to a counter instance, to being an anomaly? In the sciences, the testing situation never consists, as problem solving does, simply in the comparison of a single paradigm with nature. Okay, so in the sciences, the testing situation never consists, as it does in the puzzle solving, simply in the comparison of a single paradigm with nature. Instead, testing occurs as part of the competition between two rival paradigms for the allegiance of the scientific community. So testing, he's referring to testing meaning that they're testing the paradigm. They're testing the theories, and that is not a normal practice within the paradigm. Usually it's the only testing, or if it were, is between the paradigm and nature, not between two paradigms. They ask not whether a theory has been verified, but rather about its probability in the light of the evidence that actually exists. And to answer that question, one important school is driven to compare the ability of different theories to explain the evidence at hand. So different schools will appeal to different theories, different paradigms to solve or interpret the evidence that's at hand. The evidence is the data, and then that turns into facts as interpreted by the paradigm. On the contrary, it is just the incompleteness and imperfection of the existing data theory fit that at any time define many of the puzzles that characterize normal science. If any and every failure to fit were grounds for theory rejection, all theories ought to be rejected at all times. Do we reject a theory because it has problems? No, that's why you have the theory, is because it is to solve those problems, which are now called puzzles. So when then does a theory come up against anomalies? Well, anomalies are part of problems. So when does it change from a problem or from a problem to anomaly? When does it change from a puzzle to anomaly to a counter instance? And it's kind of like, okay, if any and every failure to fit the theory were ground for theory rejection, all theories ought to be rejected. So again, it's kind of a gray area. It's a blurry line between what is a puzzle and what is an anomaly, what is a counter instance. All historically significant theories have agreed with the facts. Well, of course, if facts are interpretations of the data produced by the reigning theory, then yeah, all historically significant theories have agreed with the facts, but only more or less. We can interpret the data, but we select the data of what we want to interpret because that fits our theory. But what does build up is more and more data that our theory can no longer interpret, and after a while we cannot ignore that data. So then what happens? Okay, but only more or less. There is no more precise answer to the question whether or how well an individual theory fits the facts. I would say it fits the data, and that we choose the data and apply our theory to it, and we get the facts out of it. And these are the facts. But if it doesn't fit our theory, then we set it aside. But the problem is when it starts accumulating a pile, then we have to start deciding what's going on here. It appears that our theory is not able to handle all this data that's produced by the more modern equipment or instruments that we have access to. But questions much like that can be asked when theories are taken collectively or even in pairs. It makes a great deal of sense to ask which of two actual competing theories fit the facts better, or which of the two competing theories interpret the data better, which is more of a straight interpretation instead of something convoluted that has to twist and turn and give its interpretation to the data. What is more simple? What is more direct? What is that theory that does not distort the data or isolate the data or only look at portion of the data that gives its explanation for it? And it says two theories. Then you compare them side by side and how they interpret that one mound of data. Though each may hope to convert the other to his way of seeing his science and its problems, neither may hope to prove his case. The competition between paradigms is not the sort of battle that can be resolved by proofs. Interesting terminology employed here. Though each may hope to convert the other to his way of seeing science and its problems. We're talking about conversions. Earlier we were talking about faith. A scientist losing faith in his paradigm to handle the reality, and now we're talking about conversion experience of converting one from one old paradigm to a new paradigm, or a competition between two. Practicing in different worlds, the two groups of scientists see different things. when they look from the same point in the same direction. Again, that is not to say they can see anything they please. Okay, they aren't seeing what is there. We have a general idea of what is there, but from our perspective, we can differ on the details of how to explain what is there according to our paradigm. But we can't employ a paradigm that just completely ignores or reinvents completely what is there. So there are limitations of what a paradigm can do. And that's why there's paradigm changes, because a paradigm can only go so far in trying to explain what is there, but it cannot change what is there. What is there, but it can be interpreted differently, but not to the degree that a person invents something totally different than what is not even there. How then are scientists brought to make this transposition between paradigms? How does a scientist change then from one paradigm to another? Part of the answer is that they are very often not. Oh, okay. How then are scientists brought to make this transposition? Well, part of the answer is they often are not. Okay. He goes on. Copernicanism made few converts for almost a century after Copernicus's death. So when Copernicus came up with this transition, this change, he didn't all of a sudden the next Sunday have a bunch of converts in his church. It said that it took almost a century after his death until there were few converts. So can it happen overnight? The revolution can, but the conversion not. So in other words, it could take quite a while for one paradigm to gain enough adherents to be the new ruling paradigm. There might be, you can't rule with two paradigms, even though at this time there are two paradigms working within biology under the Darwinism and the punctuated equilibriumism, which is proposing two different paradigms of how science progresses. But Copernicus saw few, if any, converts to his point of view. After 100 years, there was still only a few. Now he goes on to a particular interesting quote, which is one that I would have thought of earlier in the discussion, and when he was talking about paradigms change, is that one of the greatest paradigm changes, an overarching paradigm change, was from creation to evolution. And that was not addressed really in this essay, which might have been actually bigger than what the essay was trying to be. So, but we are now quoting somebody that was part of that revolution. A later part. The revolution had an impetus from 600 BC in Greek philosophy. Those were the seeds of evolutionary thought, and just the rebellion against authority and rebellion against revelation. And that continued to grow even till the time of Christ. You can see in the disciples, you can see in Thomas, where he said, unless I can touch it, feel it, put my fingers in it, hand in it, and see it, and I won't believe it, which is an empirical and reasonable type of methodology. We see coming up in the late 1800s or early 1700s, there was a lot of authority. Church authority was what governed science. And then in the 1700s, then you got the different Renaissance periods. That is rebirth. Renaissance means born again, rebirth. And what is that? And that is more of a humanistic rebirth. It's humanism that's rebirthed again in the form of ancient Greek naturalism. And that becomes a tide that's starting to push against the ecclesiastical authorities of that time, and now it is proposing the same evolutionary concept as earlier, in that it's naturalism, it's all by a closed system, and after that now we've got a melding of evolution with the ecclesiastical authority and thought, and we've got theistic evolution coming in, and that God directed the evolutionary process. This is where we have Darwin come in. Darwin, in a particularly perceptive passage at the end of his Origin of Species, wrote, "Although I am fully convinced of the truth of the views given in this volume, I by no means expect to convince experienced naturalists whose minds are stocked with a multitude of facts, all viewed during a long course of years from a point of view directly opposite to mine." There were naturalists, and that was the name of scientists at that time, because the term science and scientists did not really exist. They were called naturalists. And so he's saying the naturalists that are with him have a stockpile in their mind, that they have come from a certain viewpoint. And that viewpoint might have been linear. That viewpoint might have been, what it did have is that a lot of them included God as being the first cause, the directing cause. And Darwin proposed something totally catastrophic to that concept, a whole revolutionary change of paradigm was that there was no God, there was no purpose, there was no teleological end to evolution, in that it was all by natural selection. And so by him coming up with this mechanism of natural selection, substituting the divine hand, it changed the paradigm. And so evolution wasn't new. What was new was the mechanism that made it purely mechanical and purely naturalism. And so this is what Darwin is referring to. There are those students that have filled their mind, naturalists, with stockpile of information from a previous paradigm that will not be able to accept what I have to say. During a long course of years from a point of view directly opposite to mine, but I look with confidence to the future, to young and rising naturalists who will be able to view both sides of the question with impartiality. Now, that's kind of a disguise there, because you have to have a paradigm to look at the evidence. And then the evidence is interpreted. So in other words, nobody can view the evidence with impartiality. You have to view the evidence from a paradigm. Now, you might alternate between paradigms and view the evidence with two contrasting paradigms, but you cannot be impartial. So that's where I think that the statement from Darwin is a little shaded there, in that they are looking at the question with his paradigm in mind. Thomas Kuhn. I would argue rather that in these matters neither proof nor error is at issue. Okay, so Charles Darwin was saying, I would wait for a new group of naturalists to arise who are impartial and view the evidence, and they can decide which paradigm to jump on board with. But again, there is no impartiality. There is no viewing without a paradigm. So what helps us decide, and that's what Thomas Kuhn is, I would argue, rather, that in these matters, neither proof nor error is at issue. The transfer of allegiance from paradigm to paradigm is a conversion experience that cannot be forced. And it is a conversion experience that is not based on proof nor error. Proof nor error is at issue here. It is preference. It is something that requires a conversion experience that cannot be forced. I have some data here from a survey that had been taken in the U.S. in 1914. Charles Darwin wrote his book, Origin of Species, in 1859. And so it was a growing paradigm change that was coming. But it had not come and taken over. There were still two paradigms that were fighting. And those two paradigms, one being naturalistic evolution and the other one being divine creation, was still represented within the scientific world. But this gentleman, James Leuba, wanted to take a survey in 1914 of 400 scientists to see which boat they were on. Which paradigm were they holding on to? So he asked the question, do you believe in a God with intellectual and effective communication with mankind? Referring to open system. Referring to not only is there communication with this God, but this God has communicated through divine revelation, and he has told us what happened, how the world's got here, and what the world is really like, that it was created and created with a purpose. So he made a survey of 400 scientists asking them, do you believe in this kind of God? A God that is present, a God that you can pray to, a God that hears you, a God that created. 27.7% of the scientists in 1914 said, yes, I do. 52% said, no, we don't. And 19.6% said, I don't want to say. I don't know. So I'm on the fence. 27% of the scientists in 1914 still believed in God. And they were scientists. He polled 400 scientists, and there was, out of that 400, 27% of them, being scientists, said, yes, I believe in God. In 1933, 1933, James H. Leuba conducted the same poll. Do you believe in a God with intellectual and effective communication with mankind? 15% said yes. 68% said no. 17% were agnostic. That's a change of, from the yeses, it's a minus 12.7%. It's shrinking. In other words, they're bailing ship. They're jumping onto the other paradigm. 68% swelled by 15%. So some from the agnostic ship got on board and with the new paradigm, with the evolutionary paradigm, and some from the old paradigm, the creation paradigm, abandoned ship onto the new upcoming paradigm. 1998, a team by Edward J. Larson and Larry Whitham, they polled the National Academy of Science members the same questions. National Academy of Science. You have to be a scientist to be in the National Academy of Sciences. Do you believe in a God with intellectual and effective communication with mankind? 7% said yes, yes. It wasn't a very loud yes. It wasn't very strong. 7%. That's a decrease of 20.7% from 1914. How many said yes? 72% said yes, or said no, I don't believe in a God. I don't believe in God. I believe in a closed system. I don't believe in theistic evolution even. I believe in evolution. Evolution, just plain evolution. There is no divine hand in it anywhere. 20% said they were agnostic. The yeses had shrunk by 20%. The noes had grown by 20%. We have an upcoming paradigm. So it's not a paradigm that has from 1859 of Darwin's presenting of his origin of species, and now it's over 140 years later. We still have 7% of the scientists polled believed in God. But now 72%. So this is just reflecting the change of paradigm is not instant. The change of paradigm can be instant, but the number that get on that paradigm are not. And so it's kind of like it's after a while, there becomes such a difference, you're going to have to decide, what do you do? Do you stick with the old paradigm or do you jump aboard of the new one? Probably the single most prevalent claim and advance by the proponents of a new paradigm is that they can solve the problems that have led the old one to a crisis. When it can legitimately be made, this claim is often the most effective one possible. So what did Charles Darwin claim? Charles Darwin claimed he can explain where all the species came from. And it is survival of the fittest, but it's natural selection. Through natural selection. It is not through God's hand. And that explained a lot of things. And so that gave impetus to the paradigm. In the United States, it was illegal to teach the theory of evolution in the public schools all the way up until 1925, which was Scopes' trial. So it took a while for it to, it's been 100 years. So that's what 2025 would celebrate, would be a 100-year anniversary of the Scopes trial, when creation was still the reigning paradigm within the public school system and evolution was challenging it, and that is the Scopes trial. And after that, evolution pretty much took over the educational realm. Fortunately, there is also another sort of consideration that can lead scientists to reject an old paradigm in favor of a new one. So what is it that drives us to reject the old paradigm in favor of a new one? If it's not the proofs, if it's not the facts, it's not the evidence, then what is it? These are the arguments, rarely made entirely explicit out front, that appeal to the individual's sense of the appropriate or the aesthetic. So in other words, it's an appeal to an individual's sense of what is appropriate or the aesthetic. We're at the top level, aesthetics and values. The new theory is said to be neater, more suitable, or simpler than the old. Or if you're going for aesthetics and you're going for values, you could say the new theory sets me free. The new theory makes me feel better. The new theory makes me feel more fulfilled because I have more freedom to move around within my circles, in that I am not bound anymore by the tethers of this old theory. This old theory held me back. The new theory gives me freedom. These are the arguments, rarely made entirely explicit, that appeal to the individual's sense of the appropriate or the aesthetic. The man who embraces a new paradigm at an early stage must often do so in defiance of the evidence provided by problem solving. Problem solving is puzzle solving. So if everybody is solving their puzzles, and if you come across a puzzle you can't solve, you just put it in this pile, you take another puzzle and you work on that. But if you choose to say, there's something wrong here, and I don't believe the current paradigm is true, and it needs to be revamped, it needs to be modified, and maybe discarded, the whole thing. It says here, must often do so in defiance of the evidence provided. What is the evidence? The evidence are facts that have been interpreted by the previous paradigm. So a scientist has to go against the evidence, has to go against the facts. That's difficult. He must, that is, have faith that the new paradigm will succeed with the many large problems that confront it, knowing only that the older paradigm has failed with a few. A decision of that kind can only be made on faith. The old paradigm, scientific creation paradigm, believed that God had created life. The new paradigm, totally naturalistic, has to explain now the origin of life. And we've seen it in other chapters, quotes by Richard Dawkins, that says that, no, we have not been able to duplicate life in the laboratory yet, but that shouldn't discourage us because it appears that life is on no other planet. Therefore, life itself is a very rare event. And to even have life here on this planet then means it is a singular event that is so rare that we should not be discouraged or even confounded that we haven't been able to replicate it in the laboratory in just a few years. So he's not discouraged, but he realizes, yes, that is a problem that needs to be solved, but give us time because it is a very rare event and it's going to take a very rare puzzle solver to come to its conclusion. So in other words, again, he must, that is, have faith that the new paradigm will succeed. The new paradigm will provide the answer to life, the origin of life. Will succeed with the many large problems that confront it, knowing that only the older paradigm has failed with a few. A decision of that kind can only be made on faith. So the paradigm that we choose to follow is a choice made by faith, not by reason. It's by faith. And after we have chosen that paradigm, then the conversion experience of converts to that paradigm is a slow, gradual one that is not based on proof or evidence. It is something that is based on aesthetics, something based on what is simpler, something that makes us feel more comfortable with that paradigm. But crisis alone is not enough. There must also be a basis, though it need be neither rational nor ultimately correct, for faith in the particular candidate chosen. Wow. Let's go over that again. But crisis alone, so in other words, scientific crisis, evidence crisis, data crisis alone is not enough. There must also be a basis, though it need be neither rational nor ultimately correct, for faith in the particular candidate chosen. Wow. The resolution of revolutions. How do we resolve them? By faith. Something must make at least a few scientists feel that the new proposal is on the right track. And sometimes it is only personal and inarticulate aesthetic considerations that can do that. So something must at least convince a few scientists that they're on the right track. And sometimes it is not rational, and sometimes it is only personal, inarticulate, aesthetic considerations that can do that. And as that goes on, if the paradigm is one destined to win its fight, the number and strength of the persuasive arguments in its favor will increase. More scientists will then be converted, and the exploration of the new paradigm will go on. So, what is the resolution of revolutions? Well, it's a conversion experience. It's by faith accepting a new paradigm based on reason, based on facts, based on theory. No, it's based on aesthetics. It's based on which one is simpler, which one is better, which one do I feel more comfortable with. At most, he may wish to say that the man who continues to resist after his whole profession has been converted has ipso facto ceased to be as scientist. Okay, so if you resist, okay, we had those surveys, and if you are one of the 7% that still believe in God, in an open system, then you will cease to be considered a scientist. And you will cease to practice science because you are outside of the accepted paradigm that is now majority, 72%. That's a lot. And only 7% still confess that there is a God that they can communicate with. Session 12, wrapping up. Chapter 13. We have one more session to go. So how do we transition? What is the resolution then of revolutions? Interesting concept of how we've merged and gone from theories to worldviews to faith to converts. Where does that put science? What is the image now of science? And that is one that each one of us has to understand and has to embrace. What image of science and what paradigm that defines that science do you embrace? Have you converted to? Thanks again for accompanying us. We're Tim and Holly. And again, the addresses are here on the board. This is Chapter 13, Kuhn's Critical Thinking, session number 12. Thank you again.